Islam Makhachev just became a two-division UFC champion, and every interview somehow circles back to one man, Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov. Dana White says Abdulmanap once calmly promised him that first, Khabib would take UFC gold. Islam is laughing in interviews about a little street in Khabib's village that now bears his name, while saying fans will only understand in 10 or 15 years what Abdulmanap did for their country and for MMA. So who was this man behind the dynasty, the quiet mastermind who turned a poor mountain region into a factory of champions? So join us as we dive into 12 insane facts about Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov, the coach who, some would even go on to say, built Dagestan's MMA empire from the ground up. But before we dive into the content, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to the channel. It's a small click for you, but to us it means a lot. Thanks. Now without much ado, let's begin. Dagestan's hidden wrestling prodigy. Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov grew up in the tiny mountain village of Sildi in Dagestan, where putting kids on a wrestling mat is almost a way of life. From a young age, he lived that culture. Freestyle wrestling was his first language, and he drilled it until he earned the Soviet title of Master of Sports in freestyle wrestling, which meant the system officially recognized him as elite. Later, while serving in the Soviet army, he was introduced to judo and sambo, and immediately began folding those styles into his wrestling base. Instead of treating them as separate arts, he blended throws, trips, and submissions into one smooth, pressure-heavy game. That hybrid grappling mindset is what he eventually passed on to a whole generation of fighters. You see it every time a Dagestani shoots a clean double, rides the hips, never lets the opponent stand, and calmly works toward a dominant position. That is not random chaos. It is Abdulmanap's childhood on the mats, his military years, and his obsession with grappling, all distilled into a style that later powered champions like Khabib and Islam Makhachev. Was he Russia's Sambo GOAT? On paper, Abdulmanap's coaching resume looks almost unbelievable. In 2019, the Russian Book of Records officially recognized him as the most successful combat Sambo coach in the country, crediting him with 18 world champions trained under his guidance. Most coaches spend a lifetime chasing one world champion. Abdulmanap turned world titles into a production line. His students were winning at the very top of combat Sambo, then stepping into MMA and high-level wrestling with that same grinding style. Eagles MMA and his Dagestani camps became known for ruthless drilling, brutal conditioning, and a zero-excuses culture. If you trained there, people assumed you were built for brutal fights, not easy paydays. That is why his name carries real weight in Russian combat sports. When someone says that this guy came out of Abdulmanap's school, fans expect relentless pressure, strong fundamentals, and mental toughness. Two of his pupils, Khabib Nurmagomedov and Islam Makhachev, went on to become UFC champions, which pushed his reputation from regional legend to global coaching icon. Volkhan's grappling legacy. To understand where Abdulmanap's ideas sit in the bigger picture, you have to look at Dagestan's wider Sambo story. One of the most iconic figures from that scene is Magomedkhan Volkhan Gamzatkhanov, a Dagestani Sambo master. He made Sambo look creative, tricky, and dangerous, not just like textbook throws. Volkhan's style mixed classic Sambo with catch wrestling and judo-inspired concepts, flowing between arm locks, leg locks, and takedowns like he was improvising music. For fans, it feels like Volkhan's wild submission game helped make Russian grappling cult viewing overseas, and Abdulmanap grew up inside that same experimental Sambo culture. Here, unorthodox submissions and positional control were seen as tools to experiment with, not just memorize. So when modern fans watch Dagestani fighters chain takedowns, ride the hips, then slide into wrist control and rides, they are seeing a new chapter in a longer story. Abdulmanap did not copy Volkhan move for move. He took that spirit of technical creativity and welded it to the Dagestani work ethic, creating a blueprint his own fighters could use inside the cage. Dagestani pressure grappling secrets. The suffocating style people now call Dagestani grappling did not appear overnight. Abdulmanap spent years shaping a system with a simple goal: take you down, keep you there, and slowly drain your will to fight. One of the most famous tools in that system is the so-called Dagestani handcuff, in which the opponent's arm is trapped behind their back so they cannot post or properly defend. Conceptually, it grew out of old hammerlock and wrist ride ideas from amateur wrestling and sambo, but Dagestani fighters turned it into a trademark MMA control point. From there, his students ride the legs, clamp the hips, and keep constant pressure. Think of those Khabib sequences where both of the opponent's legs are pinned while he talks to them and punches. That is not just individual talent. That is Abdulmanap's system in action. Add his obsession with fence wrestling, walking opponents to the cage and chaining takedowns until they crumble, and you get the full suffocation package. Today, coaches around the world study that style frame by frame, trying to plug pieces of Abdulmanap's pressure blueprint into their own training. But the original version still lives in those Dagestani rooms he built. Father to two UFC kings, calling Abdulmanap just Khabib's dad is like calling Greg Jackson just a cornerman. Yes, he was Khabib's father, but he was also the principal architect of a 29-0 monster who ran through the UFC lightweight division without a single professional loss. From childhood drills in Dagestan to world title defenses, Khabib always credited his father's system as the base of everything. Then there is Islam Makhachev. He grew up inside the same grind, trained under Abdulmanap, won a combat sambo world title, then went on a ridiculous MMA run. Islam took the UFC lightweight belt, defended it 4 times, then in 2025 moved up and captured the welterweight title. Hence, he became the 11th fighter ever to win UFC titles in 2 divisions and entered many fans' most decorated lists. Fans love to argue about who is pound for pound number 1. But there is one thing most of them agree on. It is widely considered that they are 2 of the greatest lightweights ever, and now double champions. Both came out of the same tiny Dagestani system, shaped by one coach. Insane, right? That is Abdulmanap's real scoreboard. Why is Eagles MMA feared? Eagles MMA is not just a logo on Khabib's hat. It is the formal home of the Nurmagomedov School of Violence. In November 2016, Khabib and billionaire Ziauddin Magomedov founded Eagles MMA as a Russian MMA organization and team, with Khabib as president and Abdulmanap as head coach. From there, the roster turned into a who's who of Dagestani killers. Khabib, Islam Makhachev, Usman, and Umar Nurmagomedov, Tagir Ulanbekov, and others all represented or trained under the Eagles MMA banner at different points, stacking up UFC belts, Bellator belts, and World Sambo titles. Step inside the gym, and the atmosphere matches the resumes. Sessions are long, intense, and very structured. Old-school discipline from Abdulmanap, combined with modern sports science and high-level partners, turned that Makhachkala base into something bigger than a local club. Even after Abdulmanap's passing, Khabib openly says he is just continuing his father's work at Eagles MMA, making sure that the next wave of Dagestani prospects grows up under the same unforgiving standards. What was father's plan? UFC 229 looked like chaos from the outside. Bus attacks, insults, press conferences that felt like wrestling promos. Behind all that noise, Abdulmanap had a very clear idea of how to break Conor McGregor. He repeatedly downplayed McGregor's ability to fix his wrestling in a few months and predicted that once Khabib got a hold of him, only the referee would be able to help. The camp that led to that fight followed what everyone now calls father's plan. Khabib drilled walking Conor down, forcing clinches, chaining takedowns, and never giving him the clean striking fight he wanted. Javier Mendez has openly talked about reminding Khabib to stick to his father's script instead of chasing a knockout just to make a point on the feet. Watch the fight with that in mind. Round after round, Khabib does exactly what was discussed. Pressure, grappling, control, then the choke. You do not need a leaked dollar figure for the camp to see the truth. It was not a lucky punch. It was a carefully built game plan from a coach who had spent decades perfecting that style. Military steel in his coaching. Abdulmanap was not just a village wrestling coach who got lucky. He was a Soviet army veteran who learned structure, discipline, and responsibility long before he ever ran a packed gym in Dagestan. Reliable biographies are clear about this. He grew up wrestling, Then, while serving in the Soviet army, he added formal judo and sambo training to his toolbox. When he came home and started coaching full-time, that military mindset came with him. Fighters describe the same patterns over and over again. Show up on time, respect the room, work hard every round, no excuses, no shortcuts. If you trained under Abdulmanap, you were expected to behave like a professional in and out of the gym, even if you were still a teenager. That is the mentality he hammered into Khabib, Islam, and the rest of the Eagles crew. To him, the real fight started in the gym, during those brutal sessions no one sees. By the time his students walked into the octagon, they had already survived something harsher, years of army-style discipline disguised as MMA practice. That is why so many of them look calm when the cage door closes. He saw Khabib's ending. Abdulmanap was never that coach yelling fight until you're 50. He always talked about Khabib getting out early, with his health and legacy untouched. In 2019, he told Russian media that for his son, a 30-0 record would be enough, and that he wanted Khabib's final title defense to take place in Moscow. In other words, the exit door was already marked while Khabib was still smashing contenders. Khabib echoed that mindset in interviews, saying he did not plan to stick around forever and wanted a short, legendary run instead of a long, sad decline. You can feel the father and son thinking about the endgame while everyone else is obsessing over the next call-out. Then, everything changed when Abdulmanap passed away in 2020. Khabib choked out Justin Gaethje at UFC 254, moved to 29-0, and retired at 32, saying he had promised his mother he would not fight without his father. He stopped one win before father's plan, but the shape of the story stayed the same. Dominance, then a clean exit, followed by a move into coaching. Precisely the kind of career arc Abdulmanap wanted for him. How ruthless was his discipline? If you ask people who actually trained under Abdulmanap what he was like, the same word keeps popping up: discipline. He used to say that inside the cage you can fight how you want, but outside there are civilians, children and strangers, so you need to act with respect. That wasn't just a quote, it was the rule book. Khabib has told stories of his father kicking people out of practice for turning up a minute late. No "I'm stuck in traffic" excuses, no star treatment, not even for his own son. If you broke his rules, whether it was sleeping in, partying or just slacking, you could find yourself outside the room, gear in hand, watching everyone else train. Talented but lazy guys usually do fine in weak gyms. Under Abdulmanap, they simply did not survive. The atmosphere he built meant only the fighters who could handle hard work and humility stayed long enough to benefit from his system. When you see Khabib and Islam win, then immediately thank their team and talk about discipline instead of trash talk. That is his fingerprint. Under Abdulmanap, technique and character developed side by side. How did he judge brawl? Everyone remembers the image of Khabib flying over the cage at UFC 229 and launching himself at Dylan Dennis. The arena exploded, security poured in, and the whole world started debating who was right and who was wrong. Watching from home in Dagestan, Abdulmanap saw something different. He saw a lack of control, and that bothered him more than any fine. Right after the fight, he told Russian media that he would punish Khabib more harshly than any commission could, because for him, discipline always came first. You can do what you want inside the octagon, he said, but outside there are civilians, and you must behave like a man who represents his people. That is a father and a military man speaking at the same time. But here is the other side. In later interviews, he said he forgave Conor McGregor and even invited him to Dagestan as a guest, promising hospitality if he ever visited. That mix of strictness and forgiveness is pure Abdulmanap. He was willing to be hard on his own fighters, yet still tried to show dignity to the outside world. For his students, that set the standard for how a champion should act. How big is his legacy? Abdulmanap passed away in 2020, but his system is still racking up wins as if he were watching from the corner. Before his death, he was officially recognized by the Russian Book of Records for training 18 world champions in combat sambo, a number that would make most national teams jealous. That alone would lock in his status as a legend. But his real legacy is what happened next. Khabib retired at 29-0, and immediately stepped into his father's role, running camps and mentoring the next wave of Eagles MMA fighters. Islam Makhachev became the UFC lightweight champion, then the welterweight champion, fighting with the same suffocating grappling and calm intensity that came from those Dagestani rooms. Usman and Umar Nurmagomedov, Tagir Ulanbekov, and others keep adding belts and big wins under the same philosophy. So when you hear commentators talk about father's plan, they are not just being poetic, they are admitting something simple. One man from a tiny mountain region built a system that outlived him, keeps winning, and still scares entire divisions. Abdulmanap's body is gone, but his blueprint is very much alive every time a Dagestani fighter walks to the cage. Marvelous verdict. When you zoom out from all the belts, trash talk and headlines, Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov's story honestly feels almost unreal. One man from a tiny mountain village helped create an undefeated legend. His father's plan was never just about grinding opponents into the fence. It was about discipline, respect, faith, family, and knowing exactly when to walk away. Every time Islam walks out with that calm Dagestani stare, every time Khabib corners a new prospect, you are still watching Abdulmanap's work in real time. The dynasty is alive, even if the man is gone. Which fact blew your mind the most? And where do you rank Abdulmanap on the all-time coaching list? Drop your thoughts below and tell us which fighter or coach you want us to cover next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.